In 1985, a team of forensic experts in Sao Paulo opened a badly deteriorated coffin at a cemetery in Embu das Artes. Inside were human remains. The headstone bore a false name, and there was growing suspicion that the bones belonged to the most wanted man on the planet, Josef Mengele, Auschwitz's angel of death. But how did one of Nazi Germany's worst criminals end up in Brazil? And was that really his body in the coffin? Stay with us as we unravel the full story. The origins of the Angel of Death. Josef Mengele was born on March 16, 1911, in the small Bavarian town of Günzburg, Germany. The eldest of three brothers, he came from a middle-class Catholic family. His father owned a respected agricultural machinery factory that employed around 10% of the town's population. Mengele was intelligent and studious. He trained as a doctor before earning a doctorate in physical anthropology from the University of Frankfurt. He was not an ordinary man swept into Nazism by accident. He embraced the ideology with conviction from an early age, joining the Nazi Party in 1937 and the SS in 1938. But what he did next will leave you speechless. In May 1943, at the height of the Second World War, Josef Mengele arrived at the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp in occupied Poland. He was 32 years old. From that moment, one of the most disturbing chapters in the history of medicine and humanity began. Auschwitz was no forced labor camp. It was an industrial killing machine. Some 1.1 million people were murdered there, the vast majority of them Jews, but also Roma, Poles, Soviets, homosexuals, and political dissidents. Trains arrived daily from across Europe, packed with families who had little idea what awaited them. And there, on the unloading ramp, stood Mengele. At Auschwitz, survivors repeatedly described the same scene. The train stops, the carriage doors open, and people stumble out, disoriented and exhausted. Many have spent days locked inside without food or water. Mothers carry children in their arms, while elderly prisoners can barely move. And there he stands, his uniform immaculate, white gloves on his hands, a whip in his grasp. Smiling, sometimes even whistling, he studies each face with clinical attention before making a simple gesture, left or right. Left means the gas chamber. Right means forced labor. With a single motion, he decides who will live and who will die. Historian Richard J. Evans wrote that Mengele became notorious among survivors not for his experiments, but for his role in the selections. What struck them most was the expression on his face. While other doctors treated the task as a burden, Mengele seemed to carry it out with a kind of satisfaction. At times, he hummed opera as he chose. But there was one thing that made Mengele break with the usual protocol: twins. Whenever he spotted twins in a line, whether adults or children, he would practically run toward them. "Zwillinge! Zwillinge! Twins! Twins!" he shouted in German. They were immediately separated from the others and taken to a special barracks. They were not sent to the gas chamber, at least not immediately. The experiments. Why twins? Mengele had a scientific obsession with heredity. Even before the war, he had worked with his mentor, Professor Ottmar von Verschuur, on genetic research using twins as subjects. The difference was that, at Auschwitz, he had permission to do what no scientific code of ethics would ever allow. He could mutilate and kill, then perform comparative autopsies on both bodies. Children, most of them Jewish and Roma twins, underwent procedures without anesthesia. Mengele injected substances directly into their eyes in an attempt to change the color of their irises. He was particularly interested in people with heterochromia, eyes of different colors, and even tried to induce the condition artificially, with painful and often fatal results. He performed blood transfusions between twins, sewed siblings together at the back in an attempt to create conjoined twins, carried out amputations without medical justification, and exposed children to pressure and low temperatures to study the limits of the human body. Everything was meticulously documented. Mengele recorded it all. He wanted to publish scientific papers. He wanted recognition. That was what set him apart from a mere sadist. Each atrocity was carried out behind a facade of science, driven by cold rationality. Survivors described the strange duality in Mengele's treatment of children. At times, he seemed kind, bringing them chocolates and giving them affectionate nicknames. The next day, he would take them to the experimentation block. Vera Kriegel was among the survivors who testified at the mock trial held in Jerusalem in 1985. She recalled that one room at Auschwitz had an entire wall covered with human eyes removed by Mengele and pinned up like butterflies in a collection. "I thought I was dead and already living in hell," she said. Historian Nikolaus Wachsmann estimates that Mengele may have studied as many as 1,000 pairs of twins at Auschwitz. Most did not survive the experiments. How did the monster escape? In January 1945, the Soviet army was advancing into Poland. The war was nearing its end, and the Nazis knew Auschwitz was about to be liberated. On January 17, 1945, Mengele was transferred with other SS doctors to the Gross Rosen concentration camp in Lower Silesia. He took 2 boxes of specimens and the records of his Auschwitz experiments with him. As the Soviets advanced, the camp was soon evacuated. Mengele disguised himself as an ordinary Wehrmacht officer and fled west with a field hospital unit, trying to stay as far from the Red Army as possible. In June 1945, Mengele and his unit were captured by the Americans. But then, something surprising happened. Mengele was initially registered under his real name, yet no one identified him as a wanted man. Why? 2 factors came together. The Alliance had failed to distribute their lists of war criminals effectively, and there was one detail no one expected. All SS members were required to have their blood type tattooed under their left arm. It was standard protocol for battlefield identification. But Mengele, apparently out of vanity, had never been tattooed. That mark made it much harder for other Nazis to escape. Mengele avoided detection simply because he did not have it. Think for a moment about what that means. A fit of vanity saved the most wanted man in the world. In 1949, aided by a clandestine network that became known as Odessa, and using false papers supplied by networks linked to the Vatican, Mengele boarded a ship in Genoa under the name Helmut Greger. He arrived in Argentina on June 22, 1949. He was 38, and the world still believed he might be caught. Mengele began his clandestine life in South America at a very convenient moment. Argentine President Juan Domingo Perón had created a system that made it easier for Germans to enter the country. According to research by the Simon Wiesenthal Center, they included at least 300 war criminals. They were businessmen, engineers, technicians, doctors, and mass murderers. Mengele initially stayed at a hotel in Buenos Aires. He later moved into the home of a Nazi named Gerhard Malbranck. He found work at a company and registered as a mechanical technician. He felt so secure that in 1956 he applied for new documents under his real name, Josef Mengele. Yes, his real name. Around this time, he even married his brother's widow in Uruguay. They returned to Argentina together. It was as if the war had never happened. But the Nazi hunters were not idle. Simon Wiesenthal was one of the most relentless. A Polish Jew who had survived 13 concentration camps, he had also seen his wife saved by a police officer who hid her. When the war ended, Wiesenthal could have tried to rebuild his life. Instead, he devoted the next 50 years to a single mission: finding those responsible for the Holocaust and bringing them to justice. Wiesenthal had heard survivors' accounts of Mengele. He knew what the man had done, and he would not rest until he found him. Searching Argentine public records, Wiesenthal's partner, Hermann Langbein, discovered Mengele's divorce papers, which listed an address in Buenos Aires. Armed with that information, they pressured the German government to request his extradition. But by the time Argentina finally approved the request on June 30, 1960, Mengele had already fled. Adolf Eichmann, one of the principal architects of the Holocaust, had been captured by Mossad in Buenos Aires in May of that year and taken to Israel. Eichmann's trial, held in Jerusalem in 1961 and ending in his execution, shook the world and sent a clear warning to every Nazi still at large. The Israelis were coming. Mengele fled to Paraguay and shortly afterward crossed the border into Brazil in 1961. Before we continue, we want to make sure you are still with us and enjoying the story. Leave the phrase, "I want more stories" in the comments. It takes only a moment, helps more people discover this video, and your comment may be pinned to show that you were here. 18 years of invisibility. Here begins the strangest part of the entire story. Josef Mengele, the angel of death of Auschwitz, lived in hiding in Brazil for 18 years. And not in some remote jungle community. He moved through towns and cities including Nova Europa, Serra Negra, El Dorado Paulista, Caieiras, Diadema, and Embu. He also spent time in the city of São Paulo itself. From 1971 onward, he assumed the identity of an Austrian Nazi friend named Wolfgang Gerhard, who died in Graz on December 16, 1978. Mengele continued using Gerhard's identity documents until the end of his life. He lived modestly, supported by regular payments from his family in Germany. He watched Brazilian soap operas, read novels, listened to classical music, especially Johann Strauss, and worked as a caretaker on rural properties. He bore no resemblance to the impeccably dressed, smiling doctor on the selection ramp at Auschwitz. In letters to his son Rolf, Mengele wrote about daily life, Brazil, and his thoughts, but he never expressed remorse. On the contrary, whenever he addressed the war, he defended his views without hesitation. He was a man who had killed and tortured thousands of people and felt absolutely no guilt. The Mossad came close. Sometime in the early 1960s, Israeli agents following leads connected to an intermediary named Wolfgang Gerhard reached a rural area near São Paulo. There, they identified a European man they believed to be Mengele. The agent in charge, Zvi Aharoni, the same man who had coordinated Eichmann's capture, reported the discovery to the Mossad's senior leadership. But the operation was abandoned. The logistical costs, competing political priorities, and difficulty of confirming the man's identity led the Israelis to give up. Once again, Mengele escaped, this time without ever realizing how close he had come to being captured. The secret death. It was summer on the coast of São Paulo state. Mengele was spending a few days at Enseada Beach in Bertioga, visiting his friends Wolfram and Elizabeth Bossert, a couple who knew his true identity and had concealed it for years. On February 7, 1979, Josef Mengele went into the sea for a swim. He was 67 years old. While in the water, he suffered a stroke, lost control of his body, and drowned. That was how he died. Not standing trial, not in prison, not captured by Mossad, but free on a Brazilian beach with the sun on his face. The Bosserts knew they had to act quickly and discreetly. They reported his death only to people they trusted. A private wake was held, and he was buried without a public ceremony at Nossa Senhora do Rosário Cemetery in Embu das Artes, a municipality in Greater São Paulo. The name on the headstone was Wolfgang Gerhard. Mengele's true identity remained secret. Simon Wiesenthal, who had spent decades hunting him, continued to believe that he was alive. In 1982, 3 years after Mengele's death, Wiesenthal offered a reward of $100,000 for the fugitives' capture. The entire world was searching for a man who had already turned to dust in an anonymous grave in São Paulo. The discovery. In February 1985, an event thrust Mengele's name back into the spotlight. A mock trial was held in Jerusalem, where more than 100 survivors of his experiments testified about what they had endured. The proceedings shocked the world and increased pressure on governments to redouble their efforts to find him. In response, West Germany, Israel, and the United States launched a coordinated operation. Rewards were offered, and the international press went on high alert. Then came the breakthrough. On May 31, 1985, German police executed a search warrant at the home of Hans Sedlmayr, sales manager for the Mengele family business in Günzburg and the Nazi fugitive's childhood friend. They found a coded address book and copies of letters exchanged with Mengele over the years. Among the papers was a letter from Wolfram and Elizabeth Bossert informing Sedlmayr that Mengele had died in 1979. The German authorities notified the federal police in São Paulo. Romeo Tuma, then the federal police superintendent for the state, coordinated the investigation. Under questioning, the Bosserts revealed the location of Mengele's grave. On June 6, 1985, the skeletal remains were exhumed. Forensic pathologist Daniel Romero Munoz was a professor at the University of São Paulo Medical School and head of identification at the São Paulo Institute of Forensic Medicine. He received a phone call ordering him to report to the institute immediately. Half an hour later, he arrived in a red Volkswagen Beetle and found only fragments. The team had expected the coffin to be relatively well preserved. Instead, it had disintegrated over time. They had to sift through the bones in the soil itself and recover whatever they could. Teeth were missing, along with small bones. In Munoz's own words, it was a slightly more complicated puzzle. The bones were taken to the Institute of Forensic Medicine, where a group awaited them amid what the press called the Great Media Circus. Alongside 5 Brazilian specialists led by Munoz were American experts from the Simon Wiesenthal Center, specialists from the United States Department of Justice, and a team from the German government. The work began. Munoz gave the team a clear premise. I start from the assumption that they are trying to deceive me, so I look for discrepancies. The points of agreement will emerge naturally. But what did the bones reveal? The analysis was guided by a crucial document, a military dossier compiled by the Nazi German Army in 1938, containing detailed medical information on Mengele. It amounted to a complete clinical record from when he was 27. The skeleton revealed old fractures of the pelvis, shoulder, collarbone, and jaw. All were consistent with accidents and injuries documented during Mengele's life. The bone structure indicated a man between 1.73 m and 1.74 m tall, matching descriptions of the Nazi. The skull was superimposed on photographs of Mengele taken during his lifetime. This forensic technique compares the proportions of the face with those of the skull. The reference points matched. On June 13, 1985, 1 week after the exhumation, the scientists held their first press conference. The evidence strongly indicated that the remains were Mengele's. The formal conclusion came on June 21, 1985. With reasonable scientific certainty, the remains exhumed from the cemetery in Embu were those of Josef Mengele. The news spread around the world. There is one detail many people do not know. Simon Wiesenthal, the man who had devoted decades to the search, never accepted that the remains belonged to Mengele. He believed it might all have been staged, that the real Mengele could still be alive somewhere, and that someone had planted the bones to end the search and protect him. Wiesenthal was not alone. Some argued that without DNA testing, a forensic technology not yet available in 1985, absolute certainty was impossible. The question remained unresolved for 7 years. In 1992, advances in DNA identification finally made definitive confirmation possible. Rolf Mengele, Josef's only son, agreed to provide blood samples for genetic comparison. The tests were carried out in England. The result was unequivocal. The DNA matched. The remains were definitively those of Josef Mengele. There was no longer any room for escape theories. Mengele was not alive anywhere in the world. The angel of death had drowned at a Brazilian beach without ever being held accountable for his crimes. The final fate of the remains. After they were identified, Mengele's skeletal remains were kept in a vault at São Paulo's Institute of Legal Medicine. Why? The main reason was to prevent their resting place from becoming a pilgrimage site for neo-Nazi groups. His family in Germany repeatedly refused Brazilian requests to repatriate the remains. And so, for decades, they stayed there, locked in a vault. But in 2016, something happened that few would have expected. Daniel Romero Munoz himself, the forensic pathologist who had led the identification in 1985, decided to use Mengele's remains as teaching material in forensic medicine courses at the University of São Paulo. From 2016 to 2021, medical students at the University of São Paulo were required to read the book 16 to 2021. Medical residents and forensic medicine specialists learned forensic identification by examining the bones of the angel of death. Munoz explained his reasoning. Did you notice how many features were important to the identification? It is a landmark case. To illustrate that, I showed these rare features to doctors training as forensic medicine specialists. Consider the irony. The man who had spent years conducting pseudoscientific experiments on living human beings, justifying atrocities in the language of medicine, ultimately ended up serving real science, not as a researcher, but as a specimen. The bones of a man who believed himself a superior physician, a representative of Aryan racial science, became a teaching tool in the hands of Brazilian students. Today, Mengele's remains are cataloged in the collection of the University of São Paulo Medical School. So, what do you think of this ending? The most wanted man in the world died unpunished on a Brazilian beach, only to end up as teaching material at a public university. Is that justice or the absence of it? Let us know in the comments. Some believe that, in its own way, fate was cruel to Mengele. He wanted to be immortalized as a scientist. He wrote memoirs and obsessively documented his experiments. Yet he is remembered only as a monster. His studies were never published. His name became forever synonymous with cruelty. And now, his bones teach future doctors not what medicine should do, but what must never be done in its name. If you enjoyed this investigation, please like the video. It helps it reach more people. And be sure to subscribe because there is plenty more to come, and you will not want to miss it. Thank you, as always, for your wonderful company. We will see you in the next video. Until then,